On that note, we've seen that author, academic and activist Dr. Stella Nyanzi publicly denounced the lack of food distribution among the poor under lockdown in Uganda. This led to her being charged with inciting violence. Uganda currently sits at 198 confirmed cases of COVID-19 and 0 deaths so far. It has implemented one of Africa's strictest lockdowns, with only essential workers being allowed to travel. Now, Dr. Stella Nyanzi earned a large social media following for her demonstrations and bold stance against President Museveni's crackdown on political dissent. And she now joins us on the line. A very good morning to you, Dr. Stella Nyanzi, and thank you for joining us on Weekend Dawn. Can you tell us about the circumstances that motivated you to lead a demonstration for the distribution of food parcels?
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me on the program. Happy Africa Day tomorrow and happy Eid al-Fitr. I had to do something as a sign of resistance against the authoritarianism and violation of constitutional rights in the name of preventing COVID-19. The president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, gave a range of 35 directives, many of which are important in terms of fighting coronavirus. However, they were also very discriminatory in their effects on poor people in the urban areas, poor people in the rural areas, and particularly women were affected. And so the hunger, which is one of the components that we decided to focus on in my group, was obvious. The government began a food relief distribution program where poor urban families are given 6 kilograms of maize flour, 3 kilograms of beans, and pregnant women are given 2 kilograms of milk and 2 kilograms of sugar. That was the promise from Yoweri Museveni. A number of companies and organizations and individuals donated tons of food, tons of maize flour. However, less than a tenth of the capital city have received this food. Less than a tenth of the women in Kampala city had food to give to their children, and many of them are hungry, but we were locked in. We were told to stay at home because private public transport were banned, but also those of us who are non-essential services were not allowed into the city. When we entered the city, we were arrested. And so the hunger was escalating, yet there was no food distribution from the government coming to the people. And so we mobilized. Our hungry stomachs forced us to the streets to mobilize others to come and say, no, we want food. We demanded food from the government. The government prohibited social leaders, such as religious leaders and political leaders, such as members of parliament who are in touch with the people, to distribute food. In fact, Yoweri Museveni issued a decree that any individual outside the COVID task force found distributing food would be arrested and charged with attempted murder. Indeed, members of parliament have been arrested, tortured, detained, and charged with attempted murder simply because they were being hospitable to the poor around them and distributing food as individuals away from the COVID-19 task force. And so what motivated us to go to the streets in protest was the huge gap between the wealthy who wake up and go to work in huge factories, in huge garages, in huge construction sites which have been declared essential services, the huge gap between those and those of us who are very poor and destitute are not allowed to work, and yet we survive from hand to mouth. That is why we took to the streets. Hunger drove us there. Resistance against authoritarian dictates and human rights violations in the name of preventing COVID-19 took us to the streets. That was part of the motivation.
Now, Dr. Nyanzi, let's just look at what you've already alluded to. You know, you mentioned that there had been some discriminatory practices against poor people, the women, also criticizing the extreme measures. And you've also been a vocal critic of President Yoweri Museveni himself. I mean, do you find that the lockdown restriction imposed in Uganda to be more extensive than what it is needed to ultimately control the virus?
I mean, I think that, fine, there is a global pandemic, right? The world is suffering from diseases and deaths caused by a little tiny virus that we don't know. However, the world is experiencing corona differently. Uganda does not have a single death as yet from the coronavirus. Yeah. Our numbers have been limited to less than 200 so far. All the people who are, well, if one believes the government statistics that I read to us in the news daily, all our patients recover after the 14-day quarantine and they're sent home, right? And so the measures that have been undertaken are copy and paste from Europe, from China, from America. They are copy and paste without thought about contextualizing them, making them suitable for the Ugandan context. They are copy and paste from the WHO directives. And so my problem is that our problem, those of us who are resisting, is that many of the directives that the president has given in order to contain or try to contain COVID-19 do not apply to our third world, backward, patriarchal society. When they say to us to stay home and stay safe, staying home is not an option for safety, because home already is very unsafe for many of us. Women who are in abusive relationships, women who are hungry, and men are forcing them to provide food, yet they cannot go out to make a living. How can we stay safe in those environments?
Dr. Nyanzi, I just want to ask you a twofold question. I mean, you have spent some time in prison for your activism and your political views. As part of your petition, you've also called for the release of political prisoners. I just want to know what your motivation is for that. And then in the same breath, what do you have to say about Ugandan police officials who say that you are using the pandemic to further your own political views?
So there are a number of prisoners in the Ugandan prison. The congestion levels are a breeding ground, a brewing place for COVID-19. We are calling for the release of political prisoners because they are prisoners of conscience. They're not criminals. The president is mandated under the Constitution to periodically release prisoners, right? What he decided to do was to release debtors who are also incarcerated in the prisons, right? Rather than release a few debtors, he didn't make 1,000. They have arrested over 7,000 individuals in the COVID-19 lockdown period, supposedly or allegedly for breaking the COVID-19 directive. 7,000 vis-a-vis the 838 that he released. 838 debtors. However, there are tens of thousands of political prisoners who've been arrested and detained in the last 30 years of his rule. A way of decongesting the prisons is releasing these political prisoners whose only crime is criticizing the regime, criticizing the human rights violations of the regime, and indeed criticizing refusing to believe in the regime's ideology and practices.
I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. We've unfortunately run out of time. Also an academic, Dr. Stella Nyanzi, just speaking to us about the lockdown situation in Uganda, as well as a call for more urgent delivery of food parcels for the poor.